of man. It is difficult to believe that it so lies with him, so to remodel the work of nature as it would be remodeled by a destruction not only of individuals, but of entire species, and not only of a few species, but of every species, with the very few exceptions which he might spare for his own accommodation. This quotes from an 1818 speech that James Madison delivered to the Albemarle County Agricultural Society, in which he called for the preservation of species not useful to humans, but not in the same way that the 1980 report by the IUCN and WWF did as resources. The IUCN report, entitled the Global Conservation Action Plan, pointedly called for the preservation of species whose lives were not lived in areas that could be developed for human purposes, because we just don't know what future use they might have for human beings. What Madison is saying in this speech stands in opposition to this. He calls for the preservation of wild animals because not everything should or indeed can be appropriated to the service of humanity. He is saying that we must allow life to thrive for its own sake and not for ours. He feared that, and I quote again, "The whole habitable earth should be as full of people as the spots most crowded now are or might be made, and as destitute as those spots of the plants and animals not used by man." He realized the political nature of what he was saying and delivered the speech a year after his presidency in the United States. Preservation is indeed a political act. It is important not only to understand the truth of this, it is vitally important to develop the tools by which animals can possess political power. "The world was built behind our backs," wrote Stephen R.L. Clark in the book, The Nature of the Beast. "Yet it was not built by us or indeed for us. Through our occupation of it, we have claimed a right and ownership of it, but the literal bedrock of the earth, of our world, as paleontology and archaeozoology demonstrate, is built on animal lives. And while we have this very real foundation of facts, we're building these foundationless castles in the sky." This paper calls for a reanalysis of several concepts that we typically think of as manifestations of human expression into a more inclusive approach to viewing the life of the planet by putting these constructs to work in creating a change for wildlife. I believe that there are three threads that need to be tied together in order for the wildlife of the planet to thrive, and they are history, biography, and cartography. By carefully reading archival and secondary resources and sources with an eye towards animal agency, we can create histories that focus on animals as central actors. By focusing on the stories of individuals, we can create histories that focus on our shared animality. We create biographies through which we connect to their lives. Important for this conference and for the idea of heterotopias, I think that by examining cartography, both real and imagined, with the understanding that animals are agents who have their own plans, we become aware that maps are set in spatial and temporal frames, and that on each of these frames, animals overlay their designs with ours. It is also important to place them within a frame through which political change has been achieved in the past. The example of the Third Estate from the French Revolution offers an appropriate and useful analogy. This analog provides a structure that might not be immediately recognizable, so I will examine it in its historical context and demonstrate how it is relevant to the discussion of wild animal agency. I believe that reparations to wildlife are necessary, but specific plans for reparations are beyond the scope of this paper. So I think that what I'm looking at begins to offer us ways in which those questions can be addressed. It's difficult as well to define the concepts of wild and domesticated. Knowing that these frames of thought bleed over into one another through categories like tame, semi-domestic, and knowing that for every rule there are exceptions. And it's through maps and through landscape that this happens. Just as we use geography and borders to designate heritage, allegiances, and citizenship, landscaped architect and philosopher Gilles Clément's explorations of the environment offer us an approach to wild places from which we can draw a working definition of wildlife. He characterizes what he calls the third landscape in the following way. I quote, "Included in this category are left behind urban or rural sites, transitional spaces, neglected land, swamps, moors, peat bogs, also roadsides, shores, railroad embankments, and so on. To these unattended areas can be added space set aside, reserves in themselves, inaccessible places, mountain summits, non-cultivatable areas, deserts, institutional reserves, national parks, regional parks, and nature reserves." The inaccessibility of those places, we have to remember, is not only physical, but emotional and psychological. And for our purposes, the animal inhabitants of each of these places will be considered wild or wildlife. This use of landscape, as defined by Clément, enables us to include the rats, deer, pigeons, and gulls, animals that are often thought of as pests, that make use of their ability to coexist in places heavily populated by humans, and in many cases make their livings in man-made structures and feed themselves on handouts and refuse that people provide as wild animals, wild creatures. They are the inhabitants of edgelands and liminal spaces, but our inability to perceive them as more than pests limits our ability to advocate for them or even perceive theirs as wild lives. While not beginning in the 1980s, but certainly set in opposition to the literature of the decade, there have been two very important ways of thinking about wildlife. The first of the two main themes, and one that is still dominant in practice, is resource-based conservation, in which the animal is seen as having a use that fulfills a human need. This was the focus of the 1980 World Conservation Strategy prepared by the IUCN and the World Wildlife Fund. Drawing from the report's definition of conservation, offers a sound overview to the aims and goals of this practice. Conservation, and here again I quote, "is defined as the management of human use of the biosphere so that it may yield the greatest sustainable benefit to the present generation, while maintaining its potential to meet the needs and aspirations of future generations. Thus, conservation is positive, embracing preservation, maintenance, sustainable utilization, restoration, and enhancement of the natural environment. Conservation, like development, is for people." That's from the report. They continue, "We cannot predict which species may become useful to us. Indeed, we may learn that many species that seem disposable are capable of providing important products, such as pharmaceuticals, or are vital parts of life support systems on which we depend. For reasons of ethics and self-interest, therefore, we should not knowingly cause the extinction of a species. The history of human use of plant and animal species demonstrates that vanishing and apparently insignificant species can suddenly become useful, even important." The use of the word ethics in the quote there creates an interesting train of thought that might indicate that this report implies the need to behave ethically towards animals. But the only ethics that it actually addresses are the self-interests and concerns of humans. In direct opposition to this report are the writings of Canadian naturalist John A. Livingston, who set his environmental work in a different light through a movement known as fortress conservation, a conservation model based on the belief that biodiversity protection is best achieved by creating protective areas where ecosystems can function in isolation from human disturbance. Livingston sought to preserve the integrity of wild places and the life that occupied them, not with humans as beneficiaries of these efforts, but with the needs of wild animals placed first. He writes, "The definition of wildlife conservation that I use daily and from which I am working is this: the preservation of wildlife forms and groups of forms in perpetuity for their own sakes, irrespective of any connotation of present or future human use." In essence, wildlife conservation is the preservation of non-human beings in the natural settings, unaffected by human influence or activity, uncontaminated by human antibiosis, emancipated from human serfdom. Yet the very porosity of the places that we've defined as wild, even reserves and preserves, makes this concept of fortress conservation difficult, if impossible, to enact. Writing at the same time as Livingston, Robert Delort wrote El Leanimo, I'm going to mispronounce this badly, I'm sure, Entre une Histoire. In this book, he created a new type of history that had been developed by French thinkers now, such as Eric Berthet, Michel Pastoureau, and Dominique Listel, among others. Reimagining the stories is what these thinkers have set out to do, to give animal agency through history, to dehumanize certain tools of the humanities, in a sense. The one plan approach, which is what the IUCN report advocated, which has been embraced now by zoos and natural history museums, placed animal lives firmly in the hands of the scientific community. The role of other fields or disciplines is at best to serve as public relations arms in the service of science. The approach that Delort began in 1984, on the other hand, while acknowledging the importance of science, views preservation as a political, not just scientific issue, and to address it to a broad range of different tools are necessary to engage fully with this aspect, what could be considered to be a second plan approach. By moving forward with Delort's work, we can begin to create this two-plan approach through a quality that animals already possess, through their agency as developed in history, biography, and cartography. First, though, I'm going to look at the framework upon which we can build to create this change. Abbé Joseph Sayes, before the French Revolution, wrote, "What is the third estate? Everything. What has hitherto been in the political order? Nothing. What does it desire to be? To become something." Animals have no or very little political power in the world today. There are many forms in which human history is applied to the animal life of the planet, and two of the most controversial references that find their way into animal studies are references to the Holocaust and to slavery. These problematic analogies have contributed a certain amount of fractionalization within the movement, marginalizing some of the organization's involvement, and turning what might have been sympathetic listeners away. What Sayes conveys in his writing is that the third estate was a complete nation in and of itself and didn't need the other two states ruling it. To create a true third estate, that estate, one, must have something to say, two, have an identity as a collective, and within that as individuals. The third estate is a valuable frame from which to create political identity for animals because they fulfill each of these standards. First, animals not only have something to say that we seem either unable to understand, which I find hard to believe, or we are so afraid of committing the crime of anthropomorphism that we reject it. Second, animals have both collective and individual identities and agency. If we only accept the second of these propositions, it still might lead us to the idea of an animal estate as a valuable resource, which is exactly what Sayes was fighting against. When we accept both, we see this estate as a force that deserves political recognition by having a strong biographical, historical lineage of agency when we establish that it has something to say and achieve for itself. This idea has been used by Gilles Clement, as I indicated earlier, in his writing about revolutionary environmentalism as the third estate with regards to places that are neglected or inaccessible physically, emotionally, or psychologically. While we don't need to be physically involved in the wild lives of animals, they can no longer afford for us to be emotionally and psychologically detached. Further, supporting the idea of the French Revolution's ability to provide a valid example of the recognition of animal estate is what Pierre Serna notes in a piece shortened here from a journal, Annales historiques de la Révolution française. He writes, "By overthrowing the order of the living, by destroying the old orders, by imposing the construction of a new society through recognition of natural equality as its bedrock, Revolution not only overthrew the human order, but also the classifications and methods of organization into a hierarchy of all living things. A new sensitivity was being born that was concerned about life forms, the aesthetics of nature, and the importance of the animal world, with Rousseau becoming its most persuasive champion. A new science was being created that placed the observation of origin, anatomy, and knowledge of history and evolution at the heart of the question that link the common destiny of men and animals. A new philosophy appeared that demanded that the needs of the weakest should be taken into consideration. In particular, an openness to the world turned relations with animals on their head. Serna has written that the philosophers of the revolution found that animals were good not only to think with, but importantly, that animal lives were necessary to think about. The writing of history is a truly political act. Winston Churchill is credited with the statement that history is written by the victors. This is only partially true, although it certainly appears to be the case with animals. History is constantly re-examined and facts are built into new truths. Is it possible to create a similar history with animals? Yes, in fact, it's vitally important to do that. Robert Delort began the field of writing, as I mentioned, animal history by distinguishing the idea of zoohistory as separate from the history of zoology, not by downplaying science, but rather showing its limits towards creating an understanding of the animal life of the planet by examining the lives of 9 different species. In his work, he showed historians how to read between the lines of archival sources and discern animal behaviors, much as an ethologist would do, but through the lens of animal agency.
That's 5 minutes, Todd.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, let me. When we start to look at space, when we start to look at landscape and how maps work, maps are plans that are designed to be lived within, but become tools of the subordinate power structure when they are reinterpreted by those who think beyond the confines and reimagine their spaces. And I'll speed up here. In his chapter, Walking in the City, from the book, The Practice of Everyday Life, Michel de Certeau examines how humans create maps through what become an active resistance by walking. What he's saying, and he outlines 3 things, is that the production of its own space, rational organization must repress all the physical, mental, and political pollutions that will compromise it, the substitution of a know-when or a syncretic system for the indeterminable and stubborn resistance offered by traditions. And he finally looks at the creation of a universal and anonymous subject within the city itself. For maps to work, we need to have these things. We need to have the anonymity. Animals and their maps run counter to each of these, and point by point, we see how they resist. In many minds, they pollute the city physically through their presence, mentally through disgust and fear, and politically when the issues facing them become confrontational spaces between their defenders and those who seek their removal. It's not just the rat and pigeon of the city street, it's the wolf of France and the birds of prey on the Scottish moor. They resist the standardization of time that mapping seeks to impose by migrating, hibernating, even through the very creation and extinguishing of lives that can run counter to the course of time measured anywhere from days to hours to decades and beyond. By capitalizing on opportunities to use available spaces for their own purposes, they redesign the maps for their own use. The map, like the city, draws the individuality from its inhabitants under its own name, creating anonymous citizenry. But when we establish that animals have histories, biographies, and traditions that are tied spatially and temporally to places, animals lose their anonymity, and the map requires them to no longer become, they actually require of the map that they are no longer individuals. Beyond the city, fantastical monsters dwell, and in these edge lands, we find the places that are no longer pristine, liminal spots. These places are havens for wildlife in a strange juxtaposition of remembering and forgetting. Traditional territories change, and what is deemed the property of one becomes the territory of another whose boundaries are permeable. Beavers change landscapes. Wolves are the creators of, as Jim Crumley says, they were the painters of mountainsides. What we need to realize is that these animals now, because of their presence, have political power. They're changing the landscape. They're overlaying their maps on ours. Baptiste Morizot, a philosopher and explorer of animal lives, has written extensively about animals through tracking them. He writes, we need a new diplomatic deal. Imagine a nation state that believes itself sovereign and populated by citizens, people equal in law, all homogenized and connected. And all of a sudden, each interstice between each house arise others who now say, we too are cohabitants of foreigners on this territory that you say is yours. While we too say without words, it is ours. By imposing themselves in the debates, by doing damage, even by dying, they make public takeover bids. They recruit scientists and citizens as spokespersons because they do not knock on the door themselves. It is the naturalists, the militants, the ecologists, the climatologists who spot them, make them their spokesmen, and make them go up in politics. Ecological diplomacy towards non-human is an internal policy towards cohabitants among us, heterogeneous but independent. Human and animal histories and maps are not always deeply conflicting or as fraught with conflict as the examples of beavers and wolves would demonstrate, from the flocks of geese that are chased or even clubbed in industrial parks, fountains, and lawns, to butterflies whose small range of food source and egg-laying environments force them to seek different locations as a result of human development and climate change. We begin to understand that by examining the history of species, the biographies of individuals, and the maps they create, that these lives are all actively engaged in their world and in ours. An accurate knowledge of animal histories and lives will help eliminate false and potentially offensive comparisons between the past as experienced by marginalized humans with animals, and work to eradicate the over-reliance on stereotypes and biases, and in the process erode the polarities of human and animal. We need people to work to present accurate, rigorous histories, accurate, rigorous biographies. That won't be achieved without a thorough understanding of the animals themselves, of who they are and where and how they live. As we build these biographies and histories, we become aware of a fuller recognition of the things that make us human, have their origins in the animal lives of the planet. We see that living as an act of resistance. From this, we need to design realistic plans to include wild animals, both at the level of species and individuals in the human world as political agents. We can open ourselves to new questions, important questions, such as reparations, and we begin to move forward knowing that we are building the answers on firm foundations. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Todd. I don't know why the image of the elephants migrating across China came to my mind when you were talking about that. But we will move on. We're saving all questions to the end of the sessions for anybody that doesn't know. So we'll now move on to Donelle Gadenne, and her paper title is "But What Would Happen to the Veterinary Profession? A Radical Imagining of the Contemporary Western Veterinary Profession Post-Animal Liberation." So Donelle is a qualified veterinary nurse who has worked in the veterinary industry for 2 decades in Australia. She has a bachelor in writing, editing, and international cultural studies, and a master's in English. She's co-author alongside Professor Annie Potts of Animals in Emergencies, Learning from the Christchurch Earthquakes. And she's currently very near completing a PhD at Edgehill University, researching veganism in the UK veterinary profession. So it's all yours, Donelle.
Thank you. My slideshow showing?
Yes, you can put it on in presentation. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. Firstly, thank you to EACAS event organisers doing an amazing job, and to Paula for organising the symposium and for chairing this session as well. So today I'm presenting today I'm presenting something from my PhD research that I conducted for the PhD. This specific topic isn't in the PhD, but is related to the data that I collected. But I'm hoping to work on to prepare a journal article on the topic. And I'll be presenting a brief, more broad paper on the research that I conducted more broadly in the PhD at the IAVS conference in October. But for this presentation, in this presentation, I'll speak a little bit about the veterinary profession, say something about veganism, introduce and discuss some data from my doctoral research, and finish by briefly proposing a conceptual model. To begin, I'll explain how the animal medicine of the past is the veterinary medicine of today. This is important because to embark on designing anew, we have to first see and acknowledge the now. So the term veterinary is thought to derive from the Latin word veterinarius, which stems from vetrine, meaning of an animal used for pulling or carrying loads. Animal medicine began with farriery and the provision of remedial care to horses made to work, including those for transportation and in the military. Changing human, non-human animal relationship in relation to domestication, farming and agriculture is highly significant to the evolution of veterinary medicine. When humans domesticated non-human animals, proximity between humans and other species gave rise to certain issues. For example, inter-animal disease, which affected meat quality. Poor quality meat, of course, caused human illness and the loss of non-human animals as resources. Concerns about non-human animal health were really concerns about human health, since consuming spoiled or diseased meat posed risks to humans. There was also the issue of zoonosis, meaning pathogens that pass between humans and other animals, causing disease and potentially death. The keeping of domesticated animal species in intimate proximity to humans in human societies meant that communicable diseases passing between the animals themselves, but also human, non-human transmission of pathogens posed a significant concern for human health. The domestication of non-human animals for the purpose of consumption also involved the trade of animal bodies for capital gain. Thus, a further concern was the need for disease control to ensure a trade in healthy meat for human consumption, because unhealthy animals resulted in productive and economic loss. Embedded in anthropocentricity, the risk of human sickness and death from infectious disease and diseased meat, and the risk of economic loss appear to be the primary reasons why humans considered non-human species health worth protecting. Orthodox religion, philosophical thought, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment era, the industrial and agricultural revolutions, and capitalism have all played a part in how we have come to view and treat non-human animals, as well as having influenced the evolution of the veterinary profession or veterinary medicine. The contemporary veterinary profession is a microcosm of wider Western society, a society whose legal institutions deemed non-human animals as property and as beings whose interests are seconded to the interests of human animals. A society and culture that views non-human animals primarily as resources, whether it be as food or entertainment, companionship, or to perform services. While we have certainly come a long way in our understanding and recognition of many non-human animals as sentient, as sensitive social beings, socioculturally, we remain largely convinced of animals as being distinct, ourselves, humans, as being distinct from other animals. We still engage with human exceptionalism, believe in human superiority, and unquestioned human dominance. So despite women comprising the majority of veterinary students and practitioners today, Irvine and Vermillier state that the profession remains imbued with a masculine ethic and embodies masculine actions and attitudes. Trainer and Marlowe explained that this occurs within a professional epistemological framework of technical rationality and a masculine entrepreneurial structure. Clark and Knight link scientism in the veterinary profession to anthropocentric masculinity, whereby humans' needs and desires are viewed as paramount. Male veterinarians can be privileged over female veterinarians, and non-human animals are dominated by humans and rationality. In veterinary medicine, objectivity is largely valued over emotion, empathy, sentimentality, and compassion. So veganism. Veganism is an ideology that opposes unjustified and unnecessary violence against and exploitation of non-human animals, but also humans and the natural environment. In relation to its original conception, veganism is a political, radical, and subversive means to reproach and reject the ubiquitous systemic abuse and use and exploitation of non-human animals in society. As Richard White says, veganism is a strategy of resistance, And Jessica Grunbaum explains the term veganism denotes an anti-establishment politic as well as an ethic about animal liberation. It is important to note, though, that vegans exist throughout the world today, and the practice is not particular to any country, ethnicity, gender, age, or religion. Vegans are not homogenous, nor are they, in Laura Wright's words, a unified group in possession of a cohesive ideological mandate. Vegan eating practices differ, and people are vegan for various reasons and often for compound reasons. Vegans whose commitment to veganism is primarily, although not necessarily exclusively, motivated by concern for animals were the focus of this research. So between June 2019 and January 2020, I conducted semi-structured interviews with vegan veterinary professionals throughout England. They all identified as ethically motivated vegans, so primarily, although not necessarily solely, motivated by concern for animals. Participants were aged between 26 and 62 years. Participants had been veterinary professional while vegan for between 1 and 15 years, with an average of 4 to 5 years. So this research set out to explore how veterinary professionals are affected in small animal veterinary practice as vegans. It was found that they experience challenges in performing their professional role in many ways. For example, they struggle with the property status of animals, the breeding of animals for companionship, animal testing to produce pharmaceuticals, the killing of healthy or treatable animals, the ubiquity of meat-based products in the veterinary setting, using and promoting meat-based pet food, insufficient plant-based catering at workplace and industry events, vegan stigma and encountering negative vegan stereotypes, and lastly, observing speciesism, cognitive dissonance, and the meat paradox in others and in the profession more broadly. I think many of the challenges vegan veterinary professionals face in small animal veterinary practice are symptomatic of society and a culture whereby meat eating is hegemonic, and the utility-based categorization of non-human animals and their instrumentalization is socially sanctioned, normalized, and so goes largely unquestioned. At the present time, there is a sense that the veterinary profession is at a turning point and that it is undergoing a profound transformation. Hobson, West and Simmons see it as being at, quote, a pivotal moment in its history. And Yates says that it is, quote, in the middle of an hourglass between the past and the future. Terry Whiting argues the profession is trapped somewhere between a modern and postmodern paradigm. And according to veterinary ethicist Bernard Rowland, in small animal veterinary practice, the veterinary practitioner's role has moved away from the historically rooted mechanic approach to animal medicine and away from viewing companion animals as objects, property, towards the veterinarian's role being more akin to a paediatrician, although arguably the mechanic approach seems to endure in animal agricultural practice. Alongside feminisation and a turn away from large animal practice towards small animal practice, there is further evidence that reflection, reconceptualisation and reformation in the UK veterinary industry is in progress. For example, the UK veterinary profession is currently focusing on its position, role and responsibilities around some important and topical issues like diversity and sustainability. Perhaps this then presents an opportunity to reflect on some of the paradoxes in the profession in terms of its relationship to other animals. The veterinary practice was chosen for this study because it is a specific social site where humans' paradoxical relations to other animals comes into view. Applying a vegan lens to small animal practice can help us to identify and consider how to address these paradoxes. The participants were asked what role they think vegan ideology could play in the veterinary profession in terms of the profession's current values, actions, and practices. The responses fell into three categories. I have called them hopelessness, which represents those who thought the profession would not or was unlikely to change. Hopefulness, which represents those who thought the profession could and might change. And helpfulness, which represents those who saw the potential for change and had considered the role of veganism influencing such change. Several vegan veterinary professionals seem to think that the veterinary profession was unlikely to change or address the more problematic aspects of its relationship to other animals. For example, Christopher, a veterinarian, said, "It would be a major change for the profession to stop being invested in the food animal industry. the mass farming of animals, sometimes intensively, and the slaughtering of those animals. So vegan ideology would mean giving that up. It would also mean having a hard look at testing of drugs for use in animals or people, frankly, and questioning whether any of that continued to be justified, and if so, what forms of use. The veterinary profession is not going to make those changes anytime soon, because that would be a major, major paradigm shift. There would need to be an awful lot more support and pressure for those changes before anything like that was contemplated. When asked where such support and pressure might come from, Christopher said that increased awareness of the impacts of animal agriculture on climate change might play a role and, quote, increasingly provide a driving force for the reduction of animal farming, particularly cows. Another participant who had doubts about the veterinary profession's capacity or will to change and become perhaps more genuinely animal-centric was veterinary surgeon Hayley. She had many ideas about how change in the profession might look. She said, quote, well, there are a lot of things that could be done. We're not in an ideal world. What we could be doing currently, I would say, is everyone should, in my opinion, be vegan in veterinary practices. We should be drinking plant-based milk with our tea. We should be more conscious in terms of sourcing our snacks and food for the practice. We should be more eco-friendly, so we should definitely recycle more and be more conscious about the waste. Ideally, there should be options for stocking plant-based food for animals. We should be talking about it too. I think there should be more training in nutrition in general so that we know that we can safely recommend and say to the owners why we think that this food is safe for the animals. I think it would make a huge difference if we could be selling plant-based diets for our patients and feed them in the hospital environment on plant-based diets as well. Another big thing is trying to put a stop to the breeding of companion animals. So that's something that I think should really be talked about more. We should definitely be recommending adoption more and trying to discourage breeding rather than being the go-to of the breeders. When asked if she thought the veterinary profession would be open to such changes in the coming decades, Hayley replied, I don't think so. I really don't think so, no. Maybe the plant-based food, if there was more research into it and more studies and more papers that we could refer to, then that could be an option within a decade. I think that's very possible. Putting a stop to breeding, I think that would cut a lot of income in many practices, and I don't think that would be the case. Some participants were hopeful for and believed that they had already witnessed change in the profession. Veterinary surgeon Aisha noted tension between the bifurcated streams of contemporary veterinary medicine, so the companion small animal stream and agricultural or large animal practice. She explained, as younger people are becoming more aware of various issues, I think the profession is going to have to split into companion animals and large animals. That's probably what's going to happen. I think potentially, therefore, we'll probably have more ethical vegans in the companion animal industry. I think that might hopefully be something that's going to happen. I do think hopefully that's going to happen in the next 15, 20 years. She continued, I do think whether the veterinary industry decides to move with the times or not, external pressure is going to change things. Clients and with diminishing animal agriculture, potentially like dairy industries and things, hopefully it's just going to be a natural progression. But this is going to be an issue and I'm really, really excited to see what happens. The social structure is changing. And so with that, the veterinary industry will change. It will. I mean, I've seen that in the last 4 years. I barely met a single vegan before that. I met one or two, and now I know so many. It's not currently known how many vegans work as veterinary professionals in the UK, but since the veterinary profession appeals to individuals who care about animals' welfare and well-being, it may be a profession that appeals to vegans despite its moral contradictions. While vegans currently represent a demographic minority in the UK and in many other countries, the UK vegan population is thought to be increasing. Indeed, it appears to have quadrupled between 2014 and 2019. Thus, the personal and professional impacts of being vegan and the effects of practicing veganism in professional settings will increasingly become an important area of social inquiry. As vegans, many participants had thought about how the profession could, or rather should, change, and they considered what role vegans and veganism might play in this. Lucy and Natasha, both registered veterinary nurses, are two examples. I think a lot of practices would benefit from the way in which we deal with animals, the way in which we just see them, and just the empathy, I suppose, and understanding their needs. And Natasha said, I think you can just help foster a different attitude as to how we use animals for medical purposes and open horizons up as to diet and nutrition. Eventually, just challenge traditionally accepted views and values and just try and get a bit more forward thinking about how we are as a profession and how we obtain our knowledge as well. Like, do we do this ethically or not? And how can we improve things? What discussions with vegan veterinary professionals highlight is the...
Sorry,
Thank you.
5 minutes, sorry.
Thank you. What discussions with vegan veterinary professionals highlight is the value in adopting a vegan lens when examining sites where humans and other animals coexist. Veterinary profession is inextricably entwined with the animal industrial complex through its involvement with various capitalistic institutionalized forms of non-human animal and often human exploitation, from agribusiness, so species bred to be intensively farmed and factory farmed, working animal, so species bred for use for things like therapy, guiding the blind and as companions, pharmaceuticals, species bred for medical testing and used as ingredients in medicine, and entertainment, so species bred to perform in racing events, events like rodeos and to be exhibited in zoos. These forms of consumption are normative within the realm of Western culture and within the veterinary industry, but not normal when viewed through a vegan lens. The Western veterinary profession, as a microcosm of wider Western culture, accepts and reinforces anthropocentrism, speciesism, and carnism. While vegan veterinary professionals express some hope for change and have some ideas about how they think the veterinary profession could or perhaps should look, change needs to be fundamental. This means challenging and changing the view that humans are superior to other animal species, rejecting notions of human exceptionalism, avoiding privileging one species over another, and categorising animals according to their prescribed utility. It means valuing forms of knowledge other than rationality and objectivity, which in veterinary medicine, I explained, is largely valued over emotion, empathy, sentimentality, and compassion. It means no longer viewing other animals and the environment as merely exploitable resources, and it means recognising the interconnectedness of oppression through intersectionality. Scholars have begun important work in discussing and designing this much-needed shift. In conceptualising an alternative to speciesism, Michelle Westerlaken proposes multi-speciesism. Speciesism is defined as an unjustified bias against animals based on the purported superiority of the human species, whereas multi-speciesism means that multi-species, including humans, other animals, as well as other living entities such as plants, are involved in the making of worlds without assigning any particular order, direction, or hierarchy. Our imaginations are not the only place we have to turn to envisage what alternatives to speciesism might be. As Westerlaken says, using a Harawaiian concept, we already engage in multi-species worlding in ways that are more responsible towards other animals other than speciesists. She observes, it is often those humans abiding by ethically motivated vegan ideologies who are already continuously practicing engagements with the imagination of what non-speciesism can actually entail in daily life, and thereby formulate new ideas on how to live differently with other animals on an everyday basis. In creating worlds that abandon speciesism further beyond dietary habits, it becomes crucial to pay special attention to people that are already used to making vegan choices every single day. So the vegan veterinary professionals with whom I spoke provide a conduit for such an imagining or reimagining. In some cases, this led them to an uncomfortable impasse whereby they felt they should not or could not remain in the profession. That animals purposely bred by humans should not exist, and that the veterinary profession in the wake of animal liberation would become redundant. I don't think so. To imagine that animal liberation entailed humans having no relationship with other animals risks reproducing the false and problematic distinction between humans and other animals. Existing together is entirely different to exploiting another. I tried to think of some ways in which human beings with specialised skills and knowledge of non-human animal physiology and psychology might work. And I'm just being a bit playful here. I also noticed my third point there is 2 and 2, 3, just to point out my own error. So to this end, we might radically imagine what would happen to the veterinary profession if we moved towards something like a world where animals were liberated from human oppression. Instead of speciesism, we might have multi-speciesism. Instead of a veterinary profession, we might have perhaps multi-species care. Thank you.
Importance of bringing in animal biographies and histories, like paying attention to their individuality, I suppose. And I'm curious, what would be methods to do so that you have thought about and that you would propose?
Thank you for the question. There are many ways of looking at it. The historical archive, while not looking at animals the way that we look at them now, is a great place to mine for how we've perceived animals and what their agency has been. I was working on a paper about Dr. Murray Levick, who was with the 1911 Scott expedition, who used the term hooligan in order to refer to the abnormal or deviant behaviors of penguins that he was looking at. And hooligan at that point was a term that was very new and had a connotation that the scientists who had looked at that paper said they saw it as a non-specific term. I think that mining for ways that language is used in a time period historically gives us some indication of how to move forward. I think that finding the individuality, even the novel Tarka the Otter, gives us a very strong representation, stories built in landscapes. As I was looking at when I was out in the Southwest, the Western Apache believed that stories without a place aren't stories at all, that you need to have a specific point. And I think that that's, perhaps I didn't communicate that as well as I had hoped in my presentation. I kind of realized I was running out of time, scrolled forward in the paper and stopped and started. But I think that becomes very, very important. The concept of landscape, the concept of pointing something in time, temporally, spatially. Birds have dialectical languages based on where they're at as individuals. And then a dialectical bird isn't an anonymous bird any longer. It's an individual. And so looking at biographies and how we create the lives of these individuals is very important. But I think that we use nature and animals sometimes as a proxy in new nature writing, where we overlay, I was speaking about overlaying maps. I think we overlay our own emotions and emotional states on nature. We perceive it through a lens in that sense. I think that letting animals speak for themselves, even though we have to get at it through human archives when we're looking at history, is very important. Finding the way to do that by investigating language, by investigating things that are very specific to eras, I think is the way to start to approach that. If that answers.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. I love the idea of letting the animals speak for themselves and just still trying to find human ways of doing so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think if Alex Lockwood was here, he'd totally weigh in on the new nature writing. He's written a critique of that as well. So we have a question here from Michelle Westerlaken, who a lot of people have been quoting here. Do you want to ask Michelle, or shall I? Oh, here she is. Hi.
Sure, yeah, I can ask. Thank you. Thanks to all three of the speakers. I've been making a lot of notes and I found all of the presentation very interesting. I was trying to keep up with note making, Todd, in your presentation, especially just some of the references that you mentioned. So perhaps you wanted to share them either, writing in the chat, or perhaps I can make the notes right now. But I'm specifically interested in continuing the conversation on map making by animals and perhaps humans that have in some ways documented these in a way that lets the animals speak for themselves. If you were able to point to any kind of archival material, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, and what I can do is I'll put my email address in the chat, so I can send anybody. I wrote a paper physically for this conference with the references, and so I can definitely send that to you. One of the things that I think is interesting and that I didn't get to is that map making. I mentioned that Churchill says that history is written by the victors, but map making is even more so. The access and denial of resources to both humans and animals has historically been the victor. What is accessible, what is denied. But I can definitely, I'll type my email address into the chat now. As far as all the references that I was looking at.
It would be great. Thank you.
For sure, thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
Can you see the email address there?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, and I will send out definitely.
And we have Maria. Maria Martelli has a question.
Yes, thank you for the presentations. Again, they were really interesting. Unfortunately, I only caught the last two. And I have a question for Donelle, I think, but I think everybody could maybe want to weigh in on that. So first of all, I just found it really interesting, your research, Donelle, also because in my research in sanctuaries, I found so much friction with veterinarians, and maybe I didn't look enough, but I didn't find so much literature on this friction between veterinarians and animal rights activists, and the sort of ways that, you know, these frictions appear because they see and treat animals differently. So that's really interesting. And I remember from your slide, from your last slide, and what you termed multi-species care practices or something like that, and how you imagine that. Which it was really interesting, but I did not see, or maybe I was not paying attention enough, how you see relations with domestic animals or animals that are right now pets, or animals that regardless are very close or somehow very much in need of human care. And this is a question for you, but I'm also curious about how others see these relationships in a potentially I don't know if liberated, but maybe post-anthropocentric and non-speciesist future.
Thank you for your question. Can I just clarify, do you mean, like, so in my research and speaking to vegan veterinary professionals, they expressed a lot of ambiguity about, or like conflicted feelings about how they feel about companion species. So they were they tended to be very sure about how they felt about animals being bred for consumption as food. And they were okay with that just being dissipated immediately, and didn't express, for example, any concerns about that leading to, I know it's a common anti-vegan argument, but what would happen to all the animals? You know, they would go extinct. If we didn't breed them to eat them, then they wouldn't exist. But they seemed okay with that. I didn't ask specifically how they felt about it. Nobody said anything that made me think that they would be concerned about there coming an end to the breeding of domesticated animals for the purposes of food. Companion animals was harder for them because, for a couple of reasons. One is because they have close, intimate relationships with them, either as their own companion species. And I found that many of the participants that I spoke to felt the need to justify to me how they have a relationship with their companion species, and often would make sure that they told me that they rescued those animals, which was interesting, I think. They often would say that they wouldn't do it again if they were to purchase if they had purchased a pedigree animal, that they wouldn't do that again, that they would rescue. Or in the case of cats, a lot of them felt that as vegan, they couldn't ethically care for a cat because they're obligate carnivores at this time, although there are veterinarians, Andrew Knight, for example, who advocate for plant-based diets for all companion species. So for them, like if I could just keep the focus on what I got from them in terms of what they were feeling, I think that, fine. They didn't express any issues with the end to to breeding animals for consumption. For consumption as companionship, they found that more difficult, to the point where a couple of them pointed out that, you know, without companion animal species or even food consumption animal species, they wouldn't have a job. Are they okay with that? They didn't really say if that was a good thing or a bad thing. It's just something that they definitely noted. And yeah, just this, I guess, point that they got to where they decided that because if they didn't believe that it was ethical to breed species for companionship, not that they ever said that that didn't mean we have an obligation to caring for the ones that are currently in the world that exist. They, you know, came to the conclusion that maybe they wouldn't be able to function in the profession any longer with that tension between their personal values and their professional role, and hence why they had some trouble working with breeders. So I didn't ask them like what would happen to the animals if, you know, animal liberation was achieved, and what, like, I didn't specifically ask them that. So what I did is I used the data that I had and tried to think about it in terms of the symposium theme. And I found just lots of discussions about transformation, but nothing really, I think, about whether they had considered what would happen to the animals if liberation were achieved. Is that what you're asking? Yeah. In terms of the other question that you had, I found the greatest evidence of conflict between the veterinary sector in the UK and activists and or vegan activists specifically was in veterinary magazines and journals. So the Veterinary Record, Veterinary Times. There is a very distinct and definite conflict going on whereby some vegans or vegan activists who work in the veterinary profession are challenging these traditional ways of thinking about animals and trying to evoke thoughts and discussion about ways in which, you know, we could or should reconsider within the veterinary profession the way in which we relate to other species. Not always, obviously. There's a spectrum upon how those suggestions are accepted. I found plenty of evidence that in the actual practice setting, many non-vegan veterinary professionals are very accommodating, open to, considerate of, and, you know, even act as vegan allies for vegan veterinary professionals, that many non-vegan veterinary professionals are interested in sustainability and using plant-based milks in practice. So it's not something that's completely, you know, homogenous, this tension. It ebbs and flows in different settings. But in the magazines, that, like the veterinary magazines, what appears to be happening is that veganism is being perceived as a threat to the livestock sector and to the economy. And that aspect of vegan veterinary aspect of veterinary practice that is probably most incompatible with the animal farming sector with vegan ideology or vegan values. I think if you want to see or read more about the tension specifically in that regard, that's where I found the biggest repository of evidence, I guess, for tension at the vegan veterinary nexus.
Thank you. I just want to add something regarding my question, and also I think I saw a question asked in the other panel that I did not answer, which was maybe from Mitch, but I am not sure, regarding the neutering of animals in sanctuaries. And so I did not look at this issue, but just shortly I want to say that in sanctuaries, the common practice is to neuter all animals that are possible to be. So for example, male bulls are castrated, but from what I know, this is not an operation that is possible to be done for cows in Romania, from what I know. But regardless, they're not reproducing because the bulls are castrated. So coming back to my question now about the future of domesticated animals, whether we as humans breed them or not, and of companion animals, this is not the entire story, because of course they have their own agencies and they can reproduce by themselves, which is what is happening, for example, with stray dogs and this huge issue, or anyway framed as a huge issue in Romania. So if anyone wants to add to that, thanks.
Well, just quickly, I think that's really important. So in thinking about animal liberation, we're again thinking about, because we have animals who are dependent upon us through our domestication of them, that's just to achieve animal liberation and to make a decision that those animals will no longer exist, or that the ones that we have will continue to be desexed until, you know, certain groups of animals stop reproducing and cease to exist. So I guess just another form of biopower, isn't it? I mean, we're still controlling. You know, how do we just stop controlling? That's a different thing to what I'm doing here, but it's something that I think about anyway, and that I think most vegans will have encountered. But what will happen to the animals? And then that brings the question, the more philosophical question, is extinction or the cessation of breeding an animal that exists only because of human intervention, is that in and of itself a bad thing for the animals involved? It's a philosophical argument. I don't. There are plenty of other people who could probably do a better job of talking about the implications of that, but it's a question that it raises, that issue raises. Yeah, complicated, and yeah, that I think, I'll let somebody else hop in if they have anything to say as well, because the time. So does anyone have anything to add to that?
Anyone? Todd or Mitch? Or it does spark off lots of thoughts in my head. The idea of what's the biography of domesticated animals. From what Todd was saying, I don't know if Todd would have any thoughts on that question. What's, you know, the idea of de-domestication or reversing some of the harmful genetic impacts we've had, not just on livestock but on companion animals too. Like, what would be a biography of them?
I think that there are interesting issues raised through domestication. I think that we can start, if we look at insect domestication right now as a potential food source in the future, we can see how domestication actually works from its root in a way that we haven't in, you know, thousands of years, perhaps. The standardization of bodies, say for pig farming, or when I was a boy, I worked on a dairy farm, and I was talking to the farmer that I worked with recently, and he was saying that, you know, cows have been bred for 5 years now for milking cows because they break down. But the industry itself is advocating for a more medium-sized cow, something that was historically that you found in England. And that's something that's being advocated for with somebody, Roy Dennis, who's looking towards rewilding projects in the UK, is saying that these medium-sized cows don't need to be used for milk and meat as we see them, but are actually become a population that can be reestablished in the wild. We don't need to recreate the mighty aurochs of you know, of centuries ago, as has been, you know, attempted numerous times through history. That what we have actually becomes something very positive for the environment once they're allowed to return to that environment, once they're allowed to change the landscape themselves. So they don't need to disappear. Our view of them needs to change from them being a resource into something that is into their own lives, into their own biographies, allowing them to become a part of that landscape again. So I think that that's one alternative. We don't necessarily need to see what we've domesticated go extinct, and certainly there have been domestic breed extinctions. I think it's interesting that Darwin looked at, when Darwin was writing, he looked at the concept, and at that point, race was tied to breeds. The subtitle of his On the Origin of Species uses the word race. There have been races in his terms of animals that have gone extinct. But I don't think that, and he ties, as you know, from On the Origin of Species, the domestic into the wild. That's his leading point, whether or not, that's based in a good way, a non-teleological way. That is where he begins to show. And I think that we can begin from that point, from the domesticated animal, and rework it back into the wild, into something that becomes animal lives for animal lives. I hope that kind of made sense.
I might just add quickly, one of the folks I was working on in my presentation is Patricia McCormack, particularly her newest piece, the A Human Manifesto. And in that piece, she talks more so about human extinction, what she would call a voluntary human extinction, rather than like a genocide. But within her idea of extinction is the idea of like nested temporalities within one another. So we have the temporality of like a multi-species encounter, the temporality of a lifespan of an individual being, and those different lifespans from a few days to decades. And then sort of like deep time of millennia and of geological processes. And so her whole argument is that we think of human extinction as a withdrawal from encounter or becoming, but the idea of grace, the removing humans from a coercive relationship, allows for new encounters to come into being. So these would be encounters amongst species, inter and intra-species encounters, and encounters between beings in the more than human world. And so she says, for example, we have a duty of care for animals who rely on us that are already here, but for animals that are not yet here, we have a duty to step back. And for her, step back means to not reproduce and to not continue on as a species into the future, because that removal from a particular type of encounter allows other encounters to take place. So rather than like seeing extinction as a lack, whether it be an extinction of domesticated farmed animals, we could think of what if particular beings were removed from the situation in the future, what other types of encounters and beings and relationality could develop, and how would those be overlaid on different types of temporalities?
Sorry, could I just also add in there? Sorry, I can't turn my camera on, but these discussions, I don't know if anyone else has heard about it. It makes me think of it's one of the Orkney Islands. I think it's called Swona. It's up in the Scottish Orkneys. And the human populations left there, I think, in the 1960s or 1970s, because it became too remote for these human populations to live. And they couldn't round up their beef cattle on the island. And so they left. And people returned there decades on. And these herds have carried on in existence absolutely fine without the human population there. And it kind of makes me think about that real wild, should animals go extinct? Should we stay in care of them? And just in this very contextual place here in Swona, and take into account this will be different in various other locations. This cattle herd has gone on particularly fine without humans intervening one way or the other. And so that, I think that's quite a nice way of thinking, that we always have this necessary need to intervene when perhaps animals can get on quite fine without us.
Yeah, thanks for that, Stuart. But it makes me think that as soon as people start to know that, they'll be insistent on going there to find out how they're doing. It's like we can't get out of our own way half the time. And I think Michelle has a question.
Yeah, I do. And I also realized that it's almost the end of the panel, so I hope I'm not stirring up too much trouble now, but I have a question for Mitch, actually. Because I think it's quite impressive the way that you reconcile various different kind of strands of philosophy together. And now that you mentioned Patricia McCormack, also it brings up to it brings to me the question of how you do that, because there's kind of the work of people like Barad and especially Belacasa like deals with a sort of ongoingness and not creating a sort of end point in terms of like this is how it should be and we work toward it, but it's more about sort of every day doing ethics with care, versus like McCormack, who's quite a radical scholar, as you explain, and she's kind of, yeah, she's bringing it to quite an extreme point. And I wonder, you know, how you work with that in bringing these kinds of different branches of philosophy side by side in your work, because I think you did that also, you know, during the presentation quite interestingly.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's interesting because particularly that piece by McCormack is a manifesto. So it is quite polemical. Whereas Puig de Belacasa is a little bit more speculative and with a lot of posthumanism, you know, it's quite postmodern and is not interested in resolution, but is interested in the practices of care, the doingness of care, and the doingness of relating. And being entangled, but there's an interesting response to that sort of, you know, the new book out, What Comes After Entanglement, that it's not enough to explicate the type of relationships and to celebrate and bask in relationships, but to probe these relationships. You know, are there winners and losers in the relationships? Often animals are the losers in our relationships with them. And so I think McCormack is quite interesting because she frames grace, which is the leaving animals be, not as a lack or a loss, but as the opportunity for an ongoingness without us. And so I think she resolves that tension because she's interested in the becoming, but the becoming where we're not the subjects of the becoming. So it's like an ahuman or a non-anthropocentric becoming, and there's not a resolution, it's open-ended, but we won't be able to see what happens, I guess. And so I'm not really myself interested or concerned with human extinction, but I'm interested and concerned with what would become of the sciences were we to no longer use animals, kill, confine animals. And what that would mean for our ethical relating with animals. I think that there's a level of ambivalence in the writing regarding vivisection and the use of animals in Brerodati and elsewhere that I find untenable. And so I think a lot of the ideas of Brerodati and her colleagues, Haraway and others, are very beneficial, and one can read them in a critical sense, a critical animal studies sense, or one can read them in a way that allows the continued exploitation of animals. So I think folks like McCormack, who's a posthuman abolitionist, are a really helpful source to read alongside those, because it helps to provide that critical abolitionist perspective where one can use a lot of these helpful ideas about kin and kind and things from Haraway, but in a way that is in a critical sense that doesn't bask just in relationships, but tries to seek the most ethical outcome in those relationships.
Thanks for unpacking that. I think Maria also has a question continuing from this one.
Sorry for taking up the time. It's really, I have this thought on McCormack, but I just want to stress that I'm not very familiar with her work. From what I've heard, it's just that the thought of human extinction as something desirable and as something that creates grace or a relationship of grace that is well without us, except sounding like an interesting thought to think about, it strikes me to be a little bit humanist in the sense that it's essentialist it seems to think the human species as if being capable of just one kind of relationship with the other species. And I think, or I hope, that we would not be doing this to any other animal species. We would not constrain them or think of them determined in such a way. So if anyone has thoughts on that.
I think Mitch is probably the most expert on McCormack's work from all of us, but it is an interesting critique.
Yeah, and that critique has been made of McCormack to sort of homogenize and to reaffirm like a human animal binary and to homogenize sort of both camps. And I'm not, here to defend the entirety of her manifesto, but to engage with particularly with the idea of grace, which is an interesting abolitionist approach, I think, to engage in productive approach to engage with post-human thinking in a way that maintains that critical animal studies perspective. But I think it is a misreading, I think, to engage with the idea of grace as anti-relational, because I think it is relational and it's an ongoing doingness, but it's an ongoing doingness that doesn't center the human. Although I guess one could read it to say it does center the human because it's focused on what humans can do, what humans should do. But I think that there isn't as much of a tension as I think might appear on the outset between a relational care-based ethic in posthumanism or feminist theory and McCormack's work on grace and human extinction. I think they're very much working with one another rather than against one another. But I don't necessarily want to defend human extinction or the entire manifesto, but particularly those ideas I think are helpful and interesting.
Yeah, open up a space for thinking of things being different, I think. Well, if there are no other comments, I mean, everybody's free to stay here and carry on the discussion, but we've got maybe 20 minutes till the final session. So if people want to have a break and stretch their legs, and then we'll come back for the final session of the symposium at 4 o'clock. Yes, so in 20 minutes, the same space. So thank you everyone for coming and for your really stimulating conversations. Thanks to the 3 presenters too.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you to my co-presenters and for everyone for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Paula.
Okay, bye.